August 28, 1944, Château de Bourg, France, 2:17 p.m. General George S. Patton Jr. stood in front of a wall map of France, his ivory-handled revolvers on his hips, his face turning an increasingly dangerous shade of red. His Third Army had just accomplished what military strategists said was impossible. They'd advanced 400 miles in 2 weeks, liberated dozens of French towns, and were now positioned to punch straight through to the German border. They were winning, fast, brilliantly, ahead of schedule, and they were about to stop dead. Not because of German resistance, not because of casualties, not because of poor tactics or bad weather or difficult terrain, because they were running out of gas. Patton turned to his logistics officer, Colonel Walter J. Muller, and said words that would become infamous in Third Army headquarters. "Give me 400,000 gallons of gasoline, and I'll be in Berlin in 48 hours. Without it, I'm stuck here like a fly in amber." Muller looked at his clipboard. The numbers were brutal. Patton's army consumed approximately 350,000 gallons of fuel per day when advancing at combat speed. That was just fuel, not ammunition, not food, not medical supplies, not spare parts. The supply dumps at Normandy were 400 miles away. The pre-war French railway system had been systematically destroyed by Allied bombing. The ports that were supposed to be operational were either still in German hands or too damaged to use effectively. "Sir," Muller said carefully, "according to SHAEF distribution priorities, you're allocated 100,000 gallons per day. Montgomery's 21st Army Group in the north has priority for..." Patton's response was unprintable in official military correspondence, though several witnesses recorded it for posterity. The gist was clear. If headquarters wouldn't give him the fuel he needed, he'd find another way. What Patton didn't know, what he couldn't know, because it was still being organized even as he raged in his headquarters, was that the U.S. Army was already improvising a solution that would become one of the most remarkable logistical achievements in military history. It would be called the Red Ball Express. It would involve 6,000 trucks running day and night in continuous convoy. It would deliver over 12,500 tons of supplies daily, and roughly 75% of the drivers would be black soldiers serving in segregated transportation companies. These men couldn't eat in the same mess halls as white soldiers. They couldn't bunk in the same quarters. In many units, they were considered suitable only for support roles, not combat. But they could drive trucks. And for 82 days in the late summer and fall of 1944, they would drive those trucks harder, faster, and more reliably than anyone thought possible. And in doing so, they would keep Patton's advance alive, supply the liberation of France, and prove something that the U.S. Army's official segregation policy insisted wasn't true. That black soldiers were every bit as capable, dedicated, and heroic as any others. This is the story of how 6,000 men, whom the Army didn't want in combat roles, ended up winning the war through sheer determination, skill, and an ungodly number of miles driven on bombed-out French roads. It's a story about logistics as warfare, about improvisation under impossible conditions, about men who volunteered for 18-hour days driving through combat zones because they knew, even if the Army didn't acknowledge it, that they were essential. And it's a story about the moment when German generals, watching endless American convoys rolling through liberated French towns in broad daylight, realized that they weren't just losing battles. They were losing to an industrial system that could deliver supplies faster than Germany could destroy them. Let me paint you the picture of the nightmare facing Allied logistics planners in late August 1944. The D-Day landings on June 6th had been meticulously planned. Every detail calculated. Supply schedules worked out to the day, sometimes to the hour. The planners had estimated that by August 28th, roughly D+83, Allied forces would have advanced perhaps 100 miles inland from the Normandy beaches. They'd be fighting through the Bocage country, facing determined German resistance, capturing French towns one at a time. Supply lines would be relatively short. Trucks would haul material from the beaches to forward supply dumps perhaps 50 to 75 miles inland. The system would be manageable, controlled, organized. Reality was magnificently different. By August 28th, Allied forces had advanced nearly 400 miles. Patton's Third Army was approaching the Meuse River. British and Canadian forces in the north were racing toward Belgium. The German army in France was in disorganized retreat. The liberation was happening faster than anyone had planned for, which created an unprecedented logistics crisis. The port of Cherbourg, which was supposed to be operational by August, was still clearing German demolitions. The Germans had done a methodical job. They'd sunk ships in the harbor, destroyed cranes, mined the approaches, and blown up dock facilities. American engineers were working miracles, but it would be months before Cherbourg could handle the volume needed. That left trucks. Only trucks. Thousands of trucks, running hundreds of miles, carrying everything an advancing army needed to function. The mathematics were brutal. A single infantry division, roughly 15,000 men, required approximately 650 tons of supplies per day when actively engaged in combat. That included food, roughly 300 tons, fuel, 200 tons, ammunition, 100 tons, and miscellaneous supplies, 50 tons. An armored division consumed nearly double that because of fuel-hungry tanks. Patton's Third Army in late August 1944 consisted of 8 divisions, 4 armored, 4 infantry. That's a requirement of roughly 7,500 tons of supplies per day, at minimum. A standard 2.5-ton truck, the GMC Deuce and a Half, that would become the backbone of the Red Ball Express, could carry, realistically, about 5 tons of cargo when loaded properly. To deliver 7,500 tons, you'd need 1,500 truckloads, every day. Now factor in the round trip. From Normandy beaches to Patton's forward positions was roughly 400 miles one way. That's 800 miles round trip. A loaded truck, traveling on bombed-out roads through liberated French towns where civilians understandably wanted to celebrate and block traffic, could average perhaps 25 miles per hour. That's 32 hours of driving time for a round trip. Add loading time, unloading time, mechanical breakdowns, driver fatigue, and you're looking at 48 to 60 hours minimum for each complete cycle. So each truck could complete perhaps one trip every 3 days. To deliver 1,500 loads per day, you'd need 4,500 trucks in continuous rotation. And that was just for Patton's Third Army. The entire Allied force in France in late August consisted of roughly 20 divisions. The total supply requirement was staggering. Colonel John C.H. Lee, commander of the Communications Zone, CONVOY, the organization responsible for logistics, looked at these numbers in late August and realized that the conventional approach wouldn't work. Standard military logistics doctrine called for organized supply depots, controlled distribution, careful inventory management. There wasn't time for that. Patton's tanks were literally running out of fuel. Some units were already immobilized. If the supply crisis wasn't solved immediately, the entire advance would stall, giving Germany time to establish new defensive lines and potentially prolonging the war by months. Lee made a decision that was either brilliant or insane, depending on who you asked. Forget conventional logistics. Throw every available truck onto the road. Run them continuously. Designate specific routes as one-way convoy roads. Give the operation priority over everything else. And most importantly, because this was 1944 America, and racial integration was not yet military policy, staff the operation primarily with black transportation companies because those units were available and trained, even if official policy still considered them suitable only for support roles. The operation received a code name, Red Ball Express. The name came from railroad terminology. Red Ball freight was high-priority cargo that got right-of-way over everything else. That's what this would be. High-priority supplies moving with absolute priority on designated routes. The target date for full operations, August 25, 1944. That gave them less than a week to organize what would become the largest truck convoy operation in military history. Let me tell you about the men who would drive the Red Ball Express. The U.S. Army in 1944 was segregated by official policy. Black soldiers served in separate units, under white officers, generally assigned to support roles rather than combat positions. This wasn't some informal custom. It was explicit policy based on the Army's official position that racial integration would harm unit cohesion and that black soldiers were, in the view of many commanders, unsuitable for combat leadership. This policy was as wrong as it was ugly, and the Red Ball Express would help prove it. The Transportation Corps had numerous black trucking companies. These were organized units of approximately 200 men each, equipped with roughly 50 trucks, trained specifically for cargo transport. Before the Red Ball Express, they'd been doing exactly what their designation suggested: hauling supplies, moving equipment, supporting combat units from behind the lines. These men had volunteered. Many had left jobs in civilian life, driving trucks, working in warehouses, doing manual labor in a segregated economy that limited their opportunities. The Army offered steady pay, training, and the chance to serve their country, even if that country didn't offer them full equality. Now they were about to be asked to do something extraordinary. The typical Red Ball Express shift worked like this. You'd arrive at a supply dump near the Normandy beaches. You'd load your truck, 5 tons of cargo, usually fuel in jerry cans, ammunition, or food. Loading took about an hour if the system was working smoothly, longer if it wasn't. Then you'd join a convoy and start driving. The route ran from Normandy through Chartres to various forward supply dumps. Later, as the front advanced, routes would extend even further. The roads were marked with red balls painted on signs every few miles, hence the name. These routes were one-way. Traffic moved only toward the front. Empty trucks returning to the beaches used parallel roads. You drive for 10, 12, sometimes 18 hours straight. The roads were bombed-out French highways, rutted and damaged. Many bridges were temporary, Bailey bridges, thrown up by combat engineers. You'd pass through towns that had been liberated days or weeks earlier, where civilians would line the roads, waving American flags, offering wine, trying to touch the trucks for luck. And you'd do this in convoy, which meant you couldn't stop. If your truck broke down, you'd pull to the side and wait for the maintenance crews to find you. The convoy kept moving because Patton's tanks needed fuel now, not when it was convenient. The trucks were GMC, 2.5-ton cargo trucks, universally known as Deuce and a Half, or Jimmy. They were simple, rugged, and relatively reliable. 6-cylinder gasoline engine, 5-speed manual transmission, 4-wheel drive for off-road capability. Maximum speed on good roads, about 45 miles per hour. Realistic speed when loaded and running on damaged French highways, 20 to 30 miles per hour. The trucks had canvas tops, not cabs. You sat in an open seat, exposed to weather. Rain soaked you. Summer heat baked you. Dust from the truck ahead choked you. You drove in blackout conditions at night. No headlights, just following the dim taillights of the truck ahead, trusting that the driver in front of you wouldn't suddenly stop. And you did this day after day after day. Corporal James Anderson of the 3383 Quartermaster Truck Company remembered. They told us we'd be driving supplies to the front. They said it was important, critical to the war effort. They didn't tell us we'd be driving 18, 20 hours at a stretch. They didn't tell us we'd be doing it in trucks with no windshields when it rained, or that we'd be eating K-rations while we drove because there was no time to stop for proper meals. But we did it. We did it because those supplies meant American soldiers at the front could keep fighting. We did it because every gallon of gas we delivered meant Patton's tanks could advance another mile. We did it because, for maybe the first time in our lives, we were doing something that everyone acknowledged was essential. The white officers would tell us, "You men are keeping this army moving," and they meant it. For once, we weren't invisible. We weren't just support. We were the reason the war was being won. Another driver, Private Eddie Donald of the 3917 Quartermaster Truck Company, described the experience differently. People don't understand what it's like to drive a truck for 20 hours. Your hands cramp on the steering wheel. Your back aches from the rough roads. Your eyes burn from staring at the road, trying to see in the dark. You're breathing exhaust fumes from the truck ahead. You're scared you'll fall asleep and run off the road. And you can't complain, can't slow down, because you know that somewhere up ahead there's an infantry company that's run out of ammunition. There's a tank battalion that's out of fuel. There are guys your age who are fighting and dying, and the only reason they can fight at all is because you're bringing them what they need. So you keep driving. You drink coffee until your hands shake from the caffeine. You sing to yourself to stay awake. You pray a lot, and you drive. The statistics tell part of the story. At its peak, the Red Ball Express operated over 6,000 trucks. They ran 24 hours per day on one-way routes totaling roughly 700 miles. They delivered an average of 12,500 tons of supplies daily. Over the 82 days of operation, from August 25th to November 16th, 1944, they hauled approximately 412,000 tons of supplies. But statistics don't capture what it actually meant. September 3rd, 1944, near Verdun, France. General Lieutenant Hans von Luck, commander of the 21st Panzer Division, stood on a ridge overlooking a main road running through the French countryside. Through his binoculars, he could see something that made him feel a cold certainty that Germany had already lost the war. American trucks, hundreds of them, moving in convoy, in broad daylight, not scattered supply runs, not small groups trying to avoid detection, a continuous stream of vehicles, stretching as far as he could see in both directions, rolling through liberated French territory without any apparent concern for German air attack or artillery. Von Luck had fought in North Africa, in Russia, in Normandy. He'd seen German supply convoys. German logistics operated on a simple principle: move supplies at night, under cover of darkness, because Allied air superiority made daytime movements suicidal. Even at night, convoys were dangerous. Allied night fighters prowled constantly. German supply trucks traveled in small groups, dispersed, camouflaged, always listening for aircraft engines. A German division in combat was constantly worried about supply. Would fuel arrive? Would ammunition get through? Would the supply trucks make it past Allied air patrols? And here were the Americans, running what appeared to be thousands of trucks, in daylight, on main roads, with no visible concern for security beyond spacing the vehicles to limit damage from any single air attack. Von Luck lowered his binoculars and turned to his operations officer. "How long have they been running convoys like this?" "At least 2 weeks, Herr General. Our intelligence reports similar convoys on roads throughout the sector, always moving forward, always loaded. The French civilians call them le ball rouge, the red ball. The Americans have marked the routes with red circles." Von Luck was quiet for a moment, doing mental calculations. He counted approximately 50 trucks visible on the road section he could observe. The convoy was moving steadily. He estimated 20 to 25 kilometers per hour. If similar convoys were running continuously on multiple routes, how many supplies are they moving per day? The operations officer consulted his notes. Intelligence estimates at least 10,000 tons, possibly more. Most appears to be fuel and ammunition. 10,000 tons per day, moving hundreds of kilometers from the coast to forward units, in daylight, without apparent difficulty. Von Luck thought about his own division's supply situation. They were rationed to perhaps 15 days of supplies if they conserved carefully. Fuel was critically short. Ammunition was limited. Every request for supplies was met with, "We're trying, but the transport situation is difficult." If they can move 10,000 tons per day, Von Luck said quietly, then supply is not their limiting factor. Distance is not their limiting factor. The only thing limiting their advance is how fast their tanks can physically move. He paused, then said something that would appear in his post-war memoirs. "We can destroy 10 of their tanks, and 20 more arrive the next day. We can shoot down their aircraft, and more appear. We can inflict casualties, and replacements arrive within days. But these supply convoys, this is something different. This is proof that we are not fighting an army. We are fighting an industrial system that can deliver unlimited materiel to the front faster than we can possibly destroy it. This war is over. We just haven't stopped fighting yet. Other German commanders had similar realizations. General der Panzertruppen Leo Freiherr Geyer von Schweppenberg, who'd commanded German armored forces in Normandy, wrote in a report to Berlin, "American logistics capabilities exceed anything in German military experience. They move supplies in quantities that appear unlimited. Their truck convoys operate continuously, day and night, apparently without concern for fuel economy or vehicle wear. German forces are inflicting tactical casualties on these convoys, but the scale is such that even significant losses do not appear to diminish the flow of materiel. More concerning, these convoys operate with a large proportion of Negro drivers. Initial intelligence assessment was that these troops would be less capable than white American forces. Observation indicates this assessment was incorrect. The Negro truck companies operate with the same efficiency as any other American units. They maintain schedules, deliver supplies reliably, and continue operations despite difficult conditions and occasional German interdiction. Recommendation: German intelligence assessments of American Negro troops should be revised upward. Previous assumptions of inferior capability appear to be based on ideology rather than observation. A Luftwaffe intelligence report from September 1944 included this analysis. Allied supply convoys have become primary targets, but interdiction success rate is minimal. Convoys operate with strong anti-aircraft protection. When individual trucks are destroyed, convoys continue without apparent disruption. Estimated convoy capacity, 15,000 to 20,000 tons daily. Luftwaffe current sortie rate in sector, approximately 50 missions per day, declining due to fuel shortages and losses. Unable to interdict more than 2 to 3% of convoy traffic. Conclusion: Allied logistics cannot be meaningfully disrupted by current German capabilities. But perhaps the most telling observation came from German prisoners of war captured near Verdun in early September. An American intelligence officer interrogating captured soldiers noted that many mentioned the American supply convoys. One prisoner, an enlisted man from a panzer regiment, said something that the interrogator found significant enough to include in his report. "We knew the Americans had more equipment than us, more tanks, more planes, more everything. But seeing those trucks, thousands of them, always moving, always full, that's when we understood, you're not going to run out, ever. We can fight all we want, but you'll just bring more. More bullets, more fuel, more everything. That's when I knew we'd lost." Let me tell you what it was actually like to drive the Red Ball Express, because the statistics and the strategic impact don't capture the human experience. You'd wake up at 0400 hours in a tent camp near the Normandy beaches. You'd eat breakfast, if you were lucky, real scrambled eggs from powder, bacon, coffee. If you weren't lucky, K-rations. Then you'd check your truck. Oil level, tire pressure, fuel. Any mechanical issues had to be addressed now, before loading, because once you joined the convoy, you couldn't stop for minor problems. At 0600, you'd drive to the loading depot. These were massive operations. Acres of supplies organized by type: fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, spare parts. You'd be directed to a loading area based on what your convoy was hauling that day. Loading was organized chaos. Depot troops would load your truck using forklifts, hand trucks, or manual labor. 5 tons of cargo. If you were hauling fuel, that meant jerry cans, 5-gallon metal containers, each weighing about 40 pounds when full. Do the math. 5 tons is 10,000 pounds. That's roughly 250 jerry cans. They'd be loaded onto your truck bed, stacked and secured with rope netting to prevent shifting. If you were hauling ammunition, that meant crates. Rifle ammunition, artillery shells, mortar rounds, hand grenades. Each type was packed and labeled. Loading was done carefully. Nobody wanted a truck full of explosives to become unstable. By 0800, you'd be loaded and joining your convoy. A red ball convoy typically consisted of 20 to 50 trucks traveling in formation with approximately 50 yards between vehicles. This spacing served two purposes. It limited damage if one truck was hit by air attack or artillery, and it prevented road congestion. A convoy would have a lead vehicle, usually an officer's jeep, with a convoy commander. He'd navigate, set the pace, and make decisions about route changes or stops. Behind the jeep would come the trucks in sequence. Each driver was responsible for maintaining position, watching for hand signals from the truck ahead, and staying alert for problems. And then you'd drive. The routes were marked with circular signs painted red, the red ball markers that gave the operation its name. These appeared every few miles, confirming you were on the correct road. The routes were theoretically one way, but in practice, you'd occasionally encounter local French traffic, military vehicles on urgent missions, or refugees. You'd navigate around them and keep moving. The roads themselves were in varying condition. Main highways were usually passable, though often cratered from bombing or artillery. You'd slow down for craters, navigate around them if possible, and continue. Bailey bridges, temporary military bridges, crossed rivers where the original bridges had been destroyed. These were narrow, requiring careful driving to avoid running off the edge. French towns were obstacles. Civilians would line the streets, cheering, offering wine, trying to thank the Americans for liberation. Children would run alongside trucks. Women would blow kisses. Old men would salute. It was heartwarming and frustrating because you couldn't stop, couldn't really acknowledge them, couldn't accept their hospitality. You were on a schedule. Patton's tanks needed this fuel today, not tomorrow. Weather was another factor. Summer 1944 in France was actually relatively dry, but when it rained, it created problems. The canvas roof on a GMC truck didn't protect you much. Rain would blow in from the sides. You'd get soaked. Your uniform would stay damp for days. Wet roads meant reduced visibility and longer braking distances. Dust was worse. On dry days, the truck ahead would kick up clouds of dust that you'd breathe for hours. Your throat would feel raw. Your eyes would burn. You'd tie a bandana around your face like a bandit, and it would be caked with dust by midday. Mechanical failures happened constantly. Tires would blow out, not surprising given the loads and road conditions. You'd pull over if possible, signal the truck behind you to go around, and wait for a maintenance crew. Every convoy had support vehicles following. Mechanics with spare parts, medics, military police to direct traffic. If your truck broke down badly, engine failure, transmission problems, major damage, you'd wait for a wrecker. These were special trucks equipped with cranes and towing equipment. They'd haul your disabled vehicle to a maintenance depot, and you'd hitch a ride back to base on an empty truck heading that direction. But usually, you kept driving. The drivers developed techniques for staying awake during the endless hours. Some sang. Anything from hymns to bawdy songs to made-up lyrics about the Red Ball Express. Some talked to themselves, describing what they saw, narrating the drive. Some counted, counting trucks, counting kilometers, counting hours. Coffee helped. Each convoy had thermoses of coffee, distributed during brief rest stops. It was army coffee, strong enough to dissolve spoons, black as diesel oil, and absolutely essential. Benzodrine helped too, though this wasn't officially acknowledged. Benzodrine, essentially amphetamines, were issued to pilots to help them stay alert on long missions. They also found their way to truck drivers who needed to stay awake for 18-hour shifts. The Army officially frowned on this, but officers who needed supplies delivered were willing to look the other way. The most dangerous part was night driving. In blackout conditions, necessary to avoid attracting German aircraft, you drove with only minimal illumination. The truck ahead would have dim red lights on its rear, visible only from directly behind. You'd follow those lights, trusting that the driver ahead was following the road. You couldn't see more than a few yards ahead. You drove by feel, by memory of the route, by faith. Corporal Anderson described night driving. You'd start hallucinating after enough hours, not seeing things that weren't there exactly, but misinterpreting things that were. A mailbox would look like a person. A road sign would look like a tank. You'd slam on the brakes, your heart pounding, and then realize it was nothing. Falling asleep was the constant danger. Your eyes would close for just a second, just 1 second, and you'd jerk awake as your truck started drifting off the road. Everyone did it. You'd see a truck ahead weaving slightly, and you'd know the driver was fighting to stay awake. We'd do anything to stay alert. Sing loud, slap ourselves, open the door and lean out into the wind. Anything to keep our eyes open for just a few more hours. And yet, despite the exhaustion, despite the danger, despite the difficult conditions, the convoys kept running, the supplies kept flowing, the schedules were met. Because these men understood something fundamental. They were essential, not support, not auxiliary, essential. Without them, the war stopped. With them, it continued. That knowledge sustained them through the exhaustion and the danger and the 1,000 minor miseries of life on the Red Ball Express. Let me show you exactly why the Red Ball Express mattered, in numbers that even skeptics couldn't argue with. Between August 25th and November 16th, 1944, a period of 82 days, the Red Ball Express delivered approximately 412,000 tons of supplies from Normandy beach depots to forward units. That's an average of 5,024 tons per day, though peak days exceeded 12,500 tons. But raw tonnage doesn't capture the impact. Let's break it down by what was actually delivered. Fuel. Approximately 175,000 tons. At roughly 7 pounds per gallon, that's about 50 million gallons of gasoline and diesel. Patton's Third Army alone consumed roughly 350,000 gallons per day when advancing at combat speed. Without the Red Ball Express, Third Army would have been immobilized by early September. Ammunition. Approximately 140,000 tons. An infantry division in active combat consumed roughly 100 tons of ammunition per day. Rifle cartridges, mortar rounds, artillery shells, grenades, everything. An armored division used nearly double that because of tank ammunition. The Red Ball Express ensured that forward units never ran short during critical battles. Food. Approximately 60,000 tons. An American soldier in combat received roughly 4,000 calories per day, far more than most armies provided because U.S. military doctrine held that well-fed soldiers fought better. K rations, C rations, and, when possible, hot meals from field kitchens. All of it transported from the beaches. Everything else, approximately 37,000 tons. Spare parts for vehicles, medical supplies, tents, clothing, radios, the 1,000 items an army needs to function. Now let's compare this to German capabilities in the same period. German logistics in France during late summer 1944 were in collapse. The German rail system was being systematically destroyed by Allied air attack. Road convoys could only move at night because of Allied air superiority, which limited capacity. Most German units were rationed to 15 days of supplies, consumed at a carefully controlled rate. A German panzer division in late 1944 might receive 50 tons of supplies per day if it was lucky. More often, it was 20 to 30 tons. Fuel was so short that German tanks were sometimes immobilized for days waiting for refueling. Ammunition was carefully conserved. The contrast was stark. American units received supplies in relative abundance. German units operated in constant scarcity. This had direct military consequences. When Patton's Third Army reached the Moselle River in early September, they faced German defensive positions. The battle required artillery support, lots of it. American artillery fired approximately 250,000 shells during the Moselle crossing operations. That's roughly 5,000 tons of ammunition, delivered by Red Ball Express convoys, enabling Patton to overwhelm German defenses through sheer firepower. German artillery in the same sector was rationed to perhaps 10% of that expenditure because they simply didn't have the ammunition. Or consider this. When an American tank was disabled by mechanical failure or combat damage, it would typically be repaired within 48 to 72 hours because spare parts were readily available, delivered by the Red Ball Express. A German tank disabled for the same reasons might wait weeks for parts, and know or be abandoned as unrepairable because the parts simply weren't available. The cumulative effect was overwhelming. American forces could operate at high tempo, advancing rapidly, engaging in intense combat, conducting complex operations, because they had the supplies to sustain that tempo. German forces had to conserve, to carefully manage limited resources, to choose which operations they could afford to conduct based on supply availability. Let me give you a specific example. The Battle of Araucourt, September 19th to 29th, 1944. The 4th Armored Division, part of Patton's Third Army, engaged the German 5th Panzer Army in a tank battle in the rolling countryside near Araucourt. The Germans had roughly 210 tanks. The Americans had approximately 165. The battle lasted 10 days. The Germans lost 86 tanks destroyed, plus many more damaged. The Americans lost 25 tanks destroyed, plus some damaged. Why such a lopsided result when the Germans actually had numerical superiority? Part of the answer was tactical. American tank crews were well-trained. American tanks had good optics and fire control. American artillery provided excellent support. But a critical factor was logistics. When American tanks were damaged, they were quickly repaired. Replacement tanks arrived within days. Fuel was always available. Red Ball Express convoys had delivered it. Ammunition was plentiful. German tanks that were damaged often couldn't be repaired because parts weren't available. Replacement tanks didn't arrive because they couldn't be transported to the front. Fuel shortages meant German tanks sometimes couldn't maneuver effectively. Ammunition conservation meant German gunners had to make every shot count. The Red Ball Express didn't fight that battle directly, but it made American victory possible by ensuring that American forces had everything they needed to fight effectively. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, understood this. In his memoirs, he wrote, "The brilliant campaign in France during August and September 1944 was made possible by the Red Ball Express. Without this improvised but effective supply system, our armies would have been immobilized by lack of fuel and ammunition, giving Germany time to establish new defensive lines. The speed of our advance, which disrupted German plans and prevented them from regrouping, was directly enabled by the truck drivers who kept supplies moving day and night. These men performed unglamorous but absolutely essential work. They did not receive the recognition given to combat troops, but their contribution to victory was just as important." And here's the statistic that captures it best. During the 82 days of Red Ball Express operations, participating truck companies drove approximately 89 million ton miles. That's the total tonnage delivered, multiplied by the distance driven. To put that in perspective, it's equivalent to hauling 5 tons of cargo from the Earth to the Moon and back. 5 times. They did this with 1940s technology. Mechanical trucks with no power steering, no air conditioning, no advanced safety features, on roads damaged by war, through all weather conditions, day and night, and roughly 75% of the drivers were black soldiers serving in segregated units under white officers, doing work that the Army's official policy suggested they weren't fully capable of performing. The mathematics proved the policy wrong. Now, let me tell you about the price these men paid for keeping the supplies moving. The Red Ball Express wasn't safe. Truck drivers weren't in frontline combat, but they faced real dangers. German aircraft occasionally strafed supply convoys, particularly in the early weeks before Allied air superiority became total. Fighter bombers would sweep in at low altitude, machine guns firing, targeting trucks. If you were hauling fuel or ammunition, a single hit could mean your truck exploded. You'd have perhaps 2 seconds warning, the sound of aircraft engines, maybe someone shouting, and then bullets would be ripping through canvas and metal. German artillery sometimes targeted known supply routes. A shell landing near a convoy could destroy multiple trucks and kill or wound several drivers. Accidents were actually more common than enemy action. The combination of exhausted drivers, difficult road conditions, mechanical failures, and continuous operations meant crashes happened regularly. A driver would fall asleep, run off the road, overturn. A truck would lose brakes going down a hill and crash into the vehicle ahead. A tire would blow out at speed, causing loss of control. Vehicle fires were a constant concern, especially when hauling fuel. If your truck caught fire, you had seconds to get out before fuel tanks exploded. Multiple drivers died trapped in burning vehicles. The casualty figures for Red Ball Express operations aren't precisely recorded in the way combat casualties were, but post-war analysis suggests that approximately 150 to 200 drivers died during the 82 days of operations, with another 500 to 700 injured seriously enough to require hospitalization. That's a casualty rate of roughly 2 to 3%, comparable to some support units in contested areas. But beyond the physical dangers, there was the simple, brutal reality of exhaustion. Drivers routinely worked 18-hour days, some pushed to 20 hours when supply emergencies demanded it. Sleep became a precious commodity measured in hours, sometimes just minutes grabbed in the cab of a truck during brief rest stops. Medical officers treating Red Ball drivers reported chronic conditions, severe back pain from hours on rough roads, repetitive stress injuries in hands and arms from constant steering and gear shifting, hearing damage from engine noise, respiratory problems from inhaling exhaust fumes, and dust for weeks on end. Private William Scott of the 3,341st Quartermaster Truck Company described the physical toll. After 2 weeks on the Red Ball, your body just hurt everywhere. Your back ached constantly. Your hands were so stiff in the morning you could barely make a fist. Your eyes were bloodshot from dust and lack of sleep. You'd be eating and your hands would shake from exhaustion and too much coffee. But you couldn't stop. They'd give you 12 hours off, 12 hours to eat, shower, sleep, do whatever maintenance your truck needed, and then you were back on the road. Some guys could sleep through anything. I never could. I'd lie in my bunk hearing engine sounds in my head, jerking awake thinking I was still driving. I lost 20 pounds in 2 months. Most of us did. You couldn't eat right, K-rations while driving, maybe one hot meal a day if you were lucky. The doctor said we were malnourished, but they couldn't pull us off duty because there weren't enough replacement drivers. And through all of this, these men served in segregated units. They couldn't eat in the same mess halls as white soldiers when both were back at base. They couldn't use the same recreational facilities. When the Red Cross set up clubs and entertainment for troops, black soldiers often had separate, inferior facilities or weren't served at all. Letters home from Red Ball drivers frequently mentioned this bitter irony. They were essential to the war effort, praised by officers for their work, delivering the supplies that made victory possible, but still treated as second-class citizens by the very army they served. Corporal Anderson wrote to his wife, "We drive 20 hours straight hauling supplies to the front. White soldiers at the supply dumps call us heroes, say they couldn't fight without us. Officers thank us for keeping the army moving, and then we get back to base and there's a sign saying, 'Colored troops use rear entrance at the mess hall.' We're good enough to die keeping this war going, but not good enough to eat with white soldiers who never left the beach." I don't write this to complain. We all volunteered. We all believe in defeating Hitler. But I want you to know the truth of what it's like. We're fighting 2 wars, one against Germany, one for respect at home. Despite this treatment, or perhaps because of it, the black soldiers of the Red Ball Express maintained extraordinary performance standards. Their units consistently met or exceeded delivery targets. Their accident rates were comparable to or lower than white transportation units. Their discipline and professionalism impressed even skeptical officers. Lieutenant Colonel John D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander's son, who observed Red Ball operations as a junior officer, later wrote, "The Negro truck companies performed superbly under difficult conditions. Their drivers showed remarkable skill and endurance. Their maintenance crews kept vehicles operational despite limited resources. Their officers, both white commanders and black junior officers, demonstrated effective leadership. What impressed me most was their attitude. These men knew they were being asked to work harder, for longer hours, under worse conditions than most white units would tolerate. They knew they were segregated and discriminated against, and yet they took pride in their work. They competed to see which company could deliver the most tonnage. They volunteered for the most difficult runs. They wanted to prove they were as good as anyone. And they did prove it, to anyone paying attention. But official recognition was slow in coming and inadequate when it arrived. The Red Ball Express officially ended operations on November 16, 1944, as the front line stabilized and the port of Antwerp became operational, allowing supplies to be delivered by ship much closer to the front. The truck convoys were no longer necessary at the same scale. There was no formal ceremony marking the end. No medals were awarded specifically for Red Ball service. The drivers simply went back to regular transportation duties, hauling supplies in conventional patterns, rather than the emergency convoy operations. In the immediate post-war period, the Red Ball Express was barely mentioned in official histories. It was treated as a minor logistical footnote, not a critical operation that had enabled the liberation of France. It wasn't until the 1960s and 1970s, as historians began examining the role of black soldiers in World War II more carefully, that the full story of the Red Ball Express began to emerge. Oral histories were collected from surviving drivers. Official records were analyzed. The scale and importance of the operation became clear. In 1992, a memorial was erected at Fort Eustis, Virginia, now Joint Base Langley-Eustis, honoring the Red Ball Express. It features a bronze sculpture of a GMC truck with the Red Ball insignia. The inscription reads, "In memory of the soldiers of the Red Ball Express, who kept supplies flowing to Allied forces during the liberation of France, August to November 1944. Through their dedication, skill, and courage, these men proved that logistics is warfare, and that excellence knows no color." Some surviving Red Ball veterans attended the dedication. They were in their 70s and 80s by then, old men who'd been young during the war. Several spoke at the ceremony. James Anderson, by then 71 years old, said, "We didn't do it for recognition. We did it because it needed to be done. We did it because American soldiers at the front needed those supplies to keep fighting. We did it because we were soldiers, even if the Army didn't always treat us that way." But I'm glad people know now. I'm glad history records what we did, not for us personally, but for what it represented. We proved that black soldiers could handle responsibility, could work under pressure, could perform just as well as anyone when given the chance. That's what I want people to remember. Not that we were heroes, we were just doing our job, but that we did that job well, despite everything, because we believed in what we were fighting for. The Red Ball Express had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate tactical and operational success of keeping Allied armies supplied during the liberation of France. First, it fundamentally changed U.S. Army thinking about logistics. Before the Red Ball Express, military logistics followed established doctrine: supply depots, controlled distribution, careful inventory management, predictable schedules. The Red Ball threw that out and improvised something new: continuous flow, priority routing, maximum throughput regardless of conventional efficiency metrics. This just-in-time approach, delivering supplies when and where needed rather than warehousing them in anticipation of need, would influence post-war logistics thinking in both military and civilian contexts. Modern supply chain management owes something to the lessons learned on French roads in 1944. Second, it demonstrated conclusively that black soldiers could perform complex, demanding tasks at the same level as white soldiers. This was politically significant in 1944 to 45 America. The Army's official position was that racial segregation was necessary for operational effectiveness. The stated rationale was that racial integration would harm unit cohesion, and that black soldiers were less capable in critical roles. The Red Ball Express proved this wrong in the most practical way possible, by successfully accomplishing a mission that everyone acknowledged was essential to winning the war. Black drivers kept the supplies moving. Black maintenance crews kept the trucks operational. Black sergeants led their units effectively. Black junior officers demonstrated competence. This evidence contributed to growing pressure for military integration. If black soldiers could handle the Red Ball Express, why couldn't they serve in integrated combat units? The logic of segregation became harder to defend when performance proved equal capability. President Harry Truman's Executive Order 9981 in 1948, which mandated the integration of the armed forces, came just 3 years after the war's end. The performance of black soldiers during the war, including but not limited to the Red Ball Express, provided powerful evidence supporting that decision. Third, the Red Ball Express became a symbol of the unsung contributions that made victory possible. Military history tends to focus on combat, the generals who planned operations, the soldiers who fought battles, the decisive moments that changed the war's course. Logistics gets less attention because it's less dramatic. But the Red Ball Express demonstrated that logistics is warfare in industrial age conflict. You can have the best tanks, the best tactics, the bravest soldiers, and still lose if you can't deliver fuel, ammunition, and food to the front lines. The Red Ball Express kept Patton's advance alive when it should have stalled, enabled operations that shortened the war, and saved lives by accelerating Germany's defeat. The drivers who made this possible were mostly black soldiers, serving in a segregated army that officially viewed them as suitable primarily for support roles. They proved through their performance that capability and dedication aren't determined by race, a lesson that America as a whole needed to learn. Let me return to where we started, with German generals watching American supply convoys and understanding what they meant. After the war, during interrogations and in memoirs, many German commanders reflected on why Germany lost. They cited many factors: Allied air superiority, Soviet numerical advantage, Hitler's strategic errors, Germany's limited resources. But several commanders specifically mentioned Allied logistics as a decisive factor. General Oberst Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff of the German Armed Forces High Command, said during his Nuremberg trial testimony, "We understood that America had greater industrial capacity than Germany, but understanding it abstractly and experiencing it concretely are different things. When you see American supply convoys running continuously in daylight, delivering unlimited materiel to the front, you understand that industrial capacity translated into operational capability means you cannot win. A war of attrition." We also noted that many of these supply operations were conducted by Negro troops. This contradicted our assumptions about American racial policies limiting their military effectiveness. If America could mobilize its Negro population effectively for military support roles, that represented additional capacity we had not accounted for in our strategic calculations. General der Panzertruppen Hermann Balck, who commanded various panzer armies during the war, was more direct in his post-war assessment. "We lost because we couldn't match American logistics. Simple as that. We had good tanks, well-trained soldiers, experienced officers, but we couldn't keep them supplied. An army without fuel doesn't advance. An army without ammunition doesn't fight. An army without food doesn't sustain combat operations." The Americans solved this problem with trucks, thousands and thousands of trucks, driven by soldiers we had dismissed as inferior. This was our mistake. The Negro truck drivers of the Red Ball Express were every bit as effective as any German supply troops, and they had far more resources to work with. You don't win wars by having the best individual weapons or soldiers. You win wars by having the best system. America had the better system. General Lieutenant Hans von Luck, in his memoir published decades after the war, reflected on watching those convoys. "I remember standing on that ridge near Verdun, watching American trucks roll past in endless procession, and understanding with absolute clarity that Germany had lost. Not because we lacked courage or skill, our soldiers fought bravely to the end, but because we were facing an opponent who could deliver supplies faster than we could consume our own limited stocks." What made it more remarkable was learning that most of those drivers were Black Americans, men whom Nazi ideology insisted were inferior, men whom chancelled but who were demonstrating superior logistical effectiveness. It was one more piece of evidence that our ideology was based on lies. The Red Ball Express didn't defeat us in battle. It defeated us by making American victory inevitable through sheer logistical superiority. Let me bring this full circle to the beginning. General Patton, standing in front of his map, furious about fuel shortages, demanding 400,000 gallons to continue his advance. He got his fuel, not exactly when he wanted it, not in quite the quantities he demanded. Patton always demanded more than anyone could deliver, but enough to keep Third Army moving, enough to liberate France ahead of schedule, enough to reach the German border by September. He got it because 6,000 truck drivers, most of them black soldiers serving in segregated units, drove those trucks day and night through difficult conditions to make it happen. The statistics tell part of the story. 412,000 tons delivered over 82 days, 50 million gallons of fuel, 140,000 tons of ammunition, 89 million ton-miles driven. But statistics miss the human reality. Men working 18-hour days, fighting exhaustion and weather and mechanical breakdowns, taking pride in doing essential work, even when the army that employed them didn't offer them full equality. The Red Ball Express proved several things simultaneously. It proved that logistics is warfare. In industrial age conflict, the side that can deliver supplies most effectively has an enormous advantage. Combat power means nothing if your tanks are out of fuel and your artillery has no ammunition. The Red Ball Express kept Allied combat power supplied at critical moments, enabling operations that shortened the war. It proved that black soldiers were fully capable of handling demanding, essential missions. This contradicted official army policy that justified segregation. The performance of Red Ball drivers contributed to pressure for military integration that would come a few years later. It proved that American industrial and organizational capability could improvise solutions to problems that conventional doctrines said were insoluble. The logistics crisis of August 1944 should have stalled the Allied advance. Instead, American quartermasters threw together a massive truck convoy operation that worked well enough to keep supplies flowing. It proved that free people, voluntarily serving, could achieve things that coercive systems couldn't match. German prisoners watching American convoys repeatedly commented on the apparent abundance, the continuous flow, the daytime operations that German forces couldn't risk. This wasn't just superior resources, it was superior organization and motivation. And it proved something that the soldiers themselves understood viscerally, but that took decades for the broader public to recognize. That the men who hauled supplies, fixed trucks, and drove through the night were every bit as essential to victory as the men who fired rifles and commanded tanks. Corporal James Anderson, speaking at that memorial dedication in 1992, said it best. "People thank me for my service, and I appreciate that. But I want them to understand what that service meant. We didn't fight in famous battles. We didn't get medals or make headlines. We drove trucks. That was our war. But those trucks mattered. Those supplies mattered. Every gallon of gas we delivered meant an American tank could advance another mile. Every crate of ammunition meant an artillery battery could support infantry attacking German positions. Every box of food meant soldiers stayed healthy and combat effective. We didn't win the war by ourselves. Nobody wins a war by themselves. But we did our part. We kept the supplies moving. We proved we were capable of anything anyone else could do. And we helped bring our boys home faster by helping end that war sooner. That's what the Red Ball Express meant. That's what we did. And I'm proud of it." The Red Ball Express ran for 82 days. It delivered 412,000 tons of supplies. It enabled the liberation of France and Belgium, shortened World War II, and proved that logistics wins wars just as surely as combat does. And it proved that 6,000 black truck drivers serving in a segregated army that officially considered them suited only for support roles could perform an essential mission as well as anyone. And in doing so, could help change not just the war, but the army and the nation that would emerge from that war. General George Patton got his fuel. The Third Army advanced. France was liberated. And the men of the Red Ball Express went into history as proof that heroism isn't always glamorous, that essential work deserves recognition, and that capability knows no color. The mathematics don't lie. 89 million ton-miles, every single one driven by someone who volunteered to serve, worked to exhaustion, and took pride in doing a job that absolutely had to be done. Democracy works, sometimes in ways that make the difference between victory and stalemate, sometimes in ways that take decades to be properly recognized, but always when free people work together towards something larger than themselves in ways that totalitarian systems cannot match. That's what the Red Ball Express proved. That's what those 6,000 drivers accomplished. And that's why their story matters. 79 years later. The red ball markers are gone from French roads now, painted over or weathered away decades ago, but the impact remains. The precedent was set. The truth was demonstrated. When the job absolutely had to be done, it got done. Not because of orders or coercion, but because free people chose to do it, took pride in doing it well, and proved through their performance that excellence knows no color. 82 days, 6,000 drivers, 412,000 tons. The numbers tell the story. But the men who lived it told the truth. They kept the supplies moving. They kept the army fighting. They kept the war being won, and that was enough.